In this segment, we're going to take a look at the Divide tool, and that's found over here on the left-hand toolbar. Just underneath Directions is Divide. It looks like a bit of a knife. Now, the Divide tool is meant for carving pieces of fill into different pieces, I guess, so dividing it. The thing is, the Divide tool is meant for use with satin stitch, and as you can see here, I've got these rectangles, but these rectangles are actually made with step or weave fill. And so if I was to try and divide them, so I turned on my Divide tool, if I click on this rectangle right now, what happens is it defaults back to the Directions tool. It doesn't allow me to use the Divide tool on a piece of step or weave fill. So I can set this direction of a piece of weave fill, but I can't divide it. Now, if I wanted to divide these rectangles into pieces, what I could do is I could select one of the pieces of fill or the rectangle, come to its object properties and change the background from step to satin. Now that may not be the best of idea. We've got an awfully long satin stitch here, but now what you have is the ability to choose that Divide tool. And now when you come back to this object, it gives me a green dot as opposed to the red dot for the directions. And with the green dot, I could drag a line just like I did with Directions, and now when I drag my line, it actually carves that fill into pieces, and so I could actually carve this fill into several pieces if I wanted to. And when I'm done, my stitch background is made up of a series of satin columns as opposed to a piece of weave fill. Now that looks slightly odd. It's not necessarily the most common use of this. A more sort of common use or practical use would be, for example, on one of these star shapes. So for example, with the star shape, again, I could choose the directions and I could give this star whatever stitch direction we want for the background. But if you wanted to divide the star to give it like each point of the star having its own stitch direction, then what we could do, first of all, select the star, then bring up my object properties and change it to be a satin fill. And you can see here that it's just got a 90-degree stitch direction on that satin fill. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the Divide tool, and I'm going to divide this a few times. So I'll put a dividing line across the center. That cuts it in half. Then I'm going to put a dividing line across this angle this way. And I'll put a dividing line across the angle this way. Now, some of my areas have become blank, and I've found when this happens that if we just play with the shapes a little bit, that sometimes there. So there was just something that it didn't like about the way they were crossing. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I found that if that ever happens, you just play with the lines until everything looks good. Now I have each sort of point of my star as its own piece, and therefore I could then choose the Directions tool, and I could set the direction of each one of those pieces to be whatever direction seemed appropriate. I like to do a star sort of like this, where each star point has its own segment and its own stitch direction, sort of like that. And so basically what I did was I converted that weave fill into a piece of satin stitch, and then I was able to use the Divide tool to create the dividing lines, and then I was able to use the Directions tool to set the new stitch directions for each part of the star. So that's how to use the Divide tool, and also a little bit more about using the Directions tool.